Our first guest is a Rolling Stone contributing editor who's covered the music business since 2002. His fourth book, Appetite for Self-Destruction, recounts the rise and fall of the recording industry. Fascinating stuff. Here he is, Steve Knopper. Steve? Steve, great.
Thank you.
This is, let's just get right into it, because you've written this book that I think for our fans, people who watch the show, big music lovers.
You know, you could have been in the book. I
am in the book. What do you mean? There's a moment of me in the book.
I made an interview request for you. And
what happened with that? Why am I not more prominently in your book?
Not available.
I was not available.
That's what I was told. Yeah.
I will fire somebody.
Yeah.
I will take care of that. This, when you say here the spectacular crash of the record industry in the digital age, all of us know that recently, aside from obviously the economy, the music business has taken a big hit. I would have guessed that that crash started somewhere around the power of the MP3, the iPod, maybe Napster. This crash started back in the late 70s.
Well, actually, that was sort of the first crash. That was the prologue of the book. In 1979, when disco collapsed, and disco was the biggest thing, people started returning their records, people stopped buying the records.
Why? Because of this one moment, this disco demolition?
Well, the disco demolition was sort of the nail in the coffin of disco. And we're talking about an event in 1979 in Comiskey Park in Chicago, where there was a huge bonfire where a DJ named Steve Dahl asked people to bring records so he would blow them up, basically, in the middle.
This is like a radio stunt, right? This is like
exactly. Yeah. And so it was this bonfire, and he thought nobody would show up. He thought it would be a bust. Instead, 50,000 people showed up to this thing, and it became a riot, and it got huge national attention. People stormed the field, people destroyed the field, and this kind of was the final event that led to the record industry kind of collapsing and having a recession.
So disco at the time, record companies like Epic and whoever was around putting out disco records, because of this event, and then the sheepness of the rest of the country, Zeppelin, everybody, I guess, was big, and disco was dead. How did we recover from that? It was Michael Jackson, I guess.
Yeah, well, the next thing that happened was that Michael Jackson put out Thriller. So the industry was dealing with hard times for 2 or 3 years. And then around 1982, Michael Jackson put out Thriller. It was the proverbial rising tide lifts all boats.
First CD I ever bought, Thriller.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? I bet it sounded good.
It sounded great.
Yeah.
I had it in my my white Ford Probe on one of those little CD players that just every bump in the road I hit, it skipped.
You know, one of the reasons, that's funny, one of the reasons that the CD player actually got adopted, the CD as a format got adopted after much resistance by the record labels, was because these guys from Sony brought in the CD players into all the boardrooms of the labels, and they showed the little door opening and closing. And then these savvy record executives went, wow, that's really cool. And then they went for it.
So were the record execs into the switching of format of the CD, or was that a bad idea?
There was a huge resistance. I mean, as you know, and as my book shows, record executives traditionally have been very resistant to new technology.
But Michael Jackson comes out, sells a gazillion CDs.
Well, first he sold a gazillion LPs. The CD was adopted a little bit later.
Right.
And once the CD was adopted, you had Michael Jackson kind of lifting the record industry. Then you had MTV, which was a great new promotional outlet.
Oh, that's right. Okay, that was right in the early 80s, too.
Exactly, and then you had the adoption of the CD, and that just led to this gigantic boom, which in my book I call the CD boom. And it led
so there was the death of disco, a 2-year lull, and
right.
then MTV, Michael Jackson, CD acceptance, and we're into the early to mid 80s, and the record company's back to doing a lot of blow.
Yes, that's exactly hookers
right?
and blow. Yep, that's exactly.
And then somewhere along the line, spending becomes, like the economy, I guess, becomes a big issue. Where does it go south from there?
Well, you know, the CD boom lasted until roughly 2000. And I have these chapters in my book called Big Music's Big Mistakes. And one of the ones I talk about is the phasing out of the single. So there's no single format anymore. You reach the late 90s, and if you wanted to get the one Chumbawamba song, you wanted Tub Thumping, right?
Sure,
or you wanted Who Let the Dogs Out.
I do want that song, yeah.
Me too. And you actually
But you don't want the rest of the other 16 tracks, but you don't want to pay $20.
But you still had to pay $20. There was no Napster, as quaint as it seems now to people who are used to Napster.
So we go through this period of the 80s. Now, and at the same time, this is a trend that you're saying for a music fan, as the prices of the CD go up, they never lower the prices. There is this one hit, we need this sort of self-gratification. At the same time, the technology sector is jumping up, and there's young kids out there, which in the history of culture, it's usually the need of a young kid. I mean, the only reason we have color film was to see a naked lady in color, I would imagine.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Right.
And that introduces us to Sean Fanning.
Right. Sean Fanning, when the industry was at the peak of this idea of 1 or 2 or 3 hit singles, and you had to buy the album for it, which it was sort of the reason I wrote about teen pop and boy bands and Britney, because they had great pop singles, but not so great albums necessarily. And so this was happening, and coincidentally at that time, Napster comes out and allows people to cherry pick songs for free, completely demolished the entire business model.
At the VMAs in whatever year, when I went out with Sean Fanning to give an award, that was right at the height of it, because there was Metallica and Sean Fanning. Sean was wearing a Metallica shirt. I have that photo here somewhere.
Right. He made a joke about...
he made a joke. What did he say about...
something about, I got this T-shirt. Somebody shared this T-shirt with me. By the way, I haven't shown
any of these photos, but they are great. Let me just go back for a second. This is the Chicago DJ, the death of Disco Demolition.
That's Steve Dahl.
That's Steve Dahl. What a lunatic he is.
Yes.
And then here's all the people at Comiskey saying disco sucks. And I think this is really just more of a, again, once you just shove enough down somebody's throat, everybody jumps onto it. And then here's me and Sean Fanning at the VMAs. He's wearing his Metallica shirt, as you see there. And I remember hearing he had just boos and yells. And what was that really about? This was about the idea of file sharing, I guess, versus the artist getting paid for that.
Yeah, I mean, Sean Fanning invented Napster. He invented a way that people could trade these compressed audio files, MP3s, on the internet. And this was... I believe that was copyright infringement. People were sharing files for free that they didn't pay for that were copyrighted music files. And so basically the industry said, we can't have this. And so they sued him, and they sued Napster rather, and Napster went out of business after that.
Why couldn't, but the technology because this is also at a time when peer-to-peer sort of, the idea of social networking coming on and say, hey, listen, I found this great song, let me send it to you. Here's a funny video, let me send it to you. Immediate. The technology there, the algorithms that he developed, that seems genius. Sounds like his business model was crappy.
Right, exactly. His business model was, and this was debatable at the time, but the courts ultimately ruled that his business model was based on theft, on stealing. And what I don't say that's not true. It is. I do believe that was theft. But what I do in my book is criticize the record labels for not saying exactly what you just said, which is that Napster had 26 million people a month doing this kind of social networking, this pre-version of Facebook, all built around music. What a great opportunity. Let's get people to pay 20 or 30 bucks a month for this service. It would have been, I believe, the new big business model for the industry and would have preserved the future.
Yeah, you know who I blame for that whole thing?
Who?
Oprah. Let's take a break. We'll talk more with Steve right after this.